I came to Veltha because of a job listing that nobody else had applied for. That was the first thing that should have told me something. At the time, I read it as opportunity. I should have read it as a warning. The listing had been posted on a regional agricultural board, the kind of website that still uses HTML tables, the kind that hasn't been redesigned since 2009, a land management position, a small rural commune in the Eastern Hill Country, soil rotation, water usage, grazing boundaries. The salary was modest, but the accommodation was included. And I had recently ended a lease in the city under circumstances that made staying there feel impossible. A relationship had dissolved, in the specific way that relationships dissolve when one person has been quietly leaving for much longer than the other person realized. My apartment still smelled like her shampoo. I had begun eating dinner standing over the kitchen sink, which seemed to me a meaningful sign that something had to change. So I applied, received a reply within 48 hours from a man named Aldrich Voss, who identified himself only as a community representative. And I drove east on a Tuesday in late October, when the light was low and amber, and the hills had already gone the color of rust. The drive took longer than the map suggested it would, not because I took wrong turns, but because the roads narrowed gradually in a way that made me keep slowing down without quite deciding to. By the time I reached the unmarked turnoff that Aldrich had described in his email, take the gravel track past the stone wall with the iron gate. Do not take the paved road that forks left. The sun had already dropped behind the ridge. I was navigating in that blue, shadowless light that comes just before dark properly settles. The track wound through a stand of old beech trees, then opened into a shallow valley, and there was Veltharo. It was smaller than I had imagined. Perhaps 40 structures, mostly stone, arranged without obvious planning along the curve of a stream. Smoke from several chimneys. Yellow light in windows. A vegetable garden that ran the length of one building, its beds already cleared and mulched for winter. Someone had planted rows of bare-rooted fruit trees along the western slope in neat lines. They stood against the fading sky like a crowd of thin figures. It looked, to be honest, peaceful. It looked like exactly the kind of place a person might go to reset themselves. Aldrich met me at what I can only describe as the communal center, a long stone building with a wide porch that served as meeting room, storage, and something like a common kitchen. He was perhaps 65, with the particular stillness of a person who has not been in a hurry for a very long time. He shook my hand with both of his, introduced me to his wife Senne, who was already setting out bread and soup, and showed me to the small house at the north edge of the settlement that would be mine. The house was clean and cold. 2 rooms, a wood stove, a bed with a wool blanket, a desk with good light from a south-facing window. Someone had left firewood stacked inside the door. I understood it as a gesture of welcome. I lit the stove, ate the bread and soup Senna had sent with me, and listened to the silence of a place where there was no traffic, no mechanical hum of any kind, only the wind off the ridge, the occasional sound of the stream, and once, far off, what might have been a dog. I slept deeply that first night, and woke feeling something I had not felt in months, which was simply the absence of dread. The work itself was straightforward, satisfying in the physical way that outdoor work often is. I was given a set of records going back nearly 60 years, handwritten ledgers, water rights, field rotations, the movement of livestock. My job was to digitize these records, update the current data, produce reports for future planning. Aldrich had a laptop he rarely touched. He seemed faintly amazed that I could use it without instructions. There were perhaps 80 people living in Veltaro. Families, mostly. Older residents who had been there all their lives. A few younger ones who had come from outside, as I had, though none of them recently. The woman closest to me in age was a ceramicist named Petra. She had arrived 7 years earlier from a city in the south. She had a workshop near the stream, and a way of speaking that suggested she had originally been talkative and had, over the years, learned to be more careful with words. We became something like friends, not because of deep natural affinity, but because the shared context creates its own gravity. It was Petra who first mentioned, indirectly, that there were things I should know about living in Veltaro. We were walking back from the upper fields one evening, the week after I arrived. I had been commenting on the fact that nobody in the settlement seemed to use the northern track, the one that ran along the base of the ridge behind the houses, and yet it was clearly maintained. The gravel was raked. The drainage ditches were clear. Someone kept it in good condition for a path that I had never once seen anyone walk. Petra said, "It's kept up for practical reasons." Then she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Just don't use it after the light goes." I waited for more. She didn't offer more. We reached the settlement. She split off toward her workshop. I went home, made dinner, and thought about it only briefly, filing it under local eccentricity without much concern. But that was the first one. And I remember it clearly now because of everything that came after. The next few weeks had a rhythm that I found genuinely restorative. Work in the mornings, long walks in the afternoons, communal dinners twice a week in the long building. The community was not unfriendly, but it was reserved in a way that felt principled rather than cold. As though the residents had made a collective decision long ago about the value of a certain kind of personal privacy and had simply been living inside that decision ever since. Nobody asked me about my life before Veltaro. Nobody volunteered much about their own. There was a pleasantness to this that was, I think, genuinely what I needed. The communal dinners were presided over, loosely, by the elders. I use that word not as an honorific, but as the word the community itself used, without apparent self-consciousness. There were 4 of them. Aldrich was one. The others were a woman named Corvin, who was perhaps 70, with the kind of lean, angular face that makes a person look permanently skeptical. A man called Marin, whose precise age I could never determine, but whose hands were entirely the hands of someone who had spent decades in physical work. And Theodis, who was the eldest, who said very little, but whose presence at the table seemed to organize the room around him without his doing anything in particular. They sat together at every communal dinner, not at the head of the table, at one end, and the conversations that reached them seemed to naturally slow down and become more careful, the way a river slows when it widens. The atmosphere wasn't fearful. I want to be clear about that. Fear would have been legible to me. It was more like being in the presence of a teacher you deeply respect, or a judge, a mild, continuous deference. It was around this time that I began to notice a few other things, not rules exactly, not yet, but patterns of behavior that repeated with enough consistency that they started to feel like something more than personal habit. The children did not play near the stream after 3 in the afternoon. This was not a rule anyone stated to me. It was simply something I observed over several weeks. The children were present near the stream in the mornings, sometimes in the early afternoon. But by the time the light began to angle, they were always somewhere else. They didn't seem distressed by this. They moved away from the stream as naturally as geese move before a storm, as though the transition were built into them at a level below thought. The well on the eastern side of the settlement was never used for drinking water. There were 3 wells, but this one was older, with a stone coping that had to be at least 2 centuries old. People drew from it for their gardens, for washing tools. The bucket was always clean, the mechanism oiled, the well clearly functional. But when I mentioned, casually, that I had drawn a cup from the east well while working nearby, a woman named Hilda looked at me with an expression I can only describe as involuntary alarm, before she composed herself, and said, "The west well's water tastes better. That's all," and moved away. I dumped the cup, not because I was frightened, but because the look on Hilda's face had been so unguarded, so briefly and honestly surprised, that it seemed rude not to. There was also the matter of the old building at the southern edge of the settlement. It was noticeably older than the others, made of a different stone. It had no windows on the ground floor. The upper floor had 2 small windows, shuttered. The door was heavy wood, bound with iron, and it was always locked. I asked Aldrich about it during one of our early working meetings, in noting that it wasn't in the land records and I wasn't sure how to categorize it. He said, "That building is outside the scope of the land management work. You don't need to document it." He said it pleasantly, without any variation in his tone, and went back to the paper he was reviewing. I wrote not for records in my notebook and felt that the conversation was complete, though I thought about the building periodically afterward. The way you think about a tooth that occasionally aches without ever quite being worth addressing. By the time winter arrived properly, I had begun to feel that I understood the shape of the place, if not its full substance. It was during this period that I came to understand more about Theodis, the oldest of the elders. He rarely attended the communal dinners, I realized. I had assumed, initially, that I simply hadn't noticed him. But when I began paying attention, it was clear he appeared perhaps once every 2 weeks, and always left early. He walked with a stick, though not because he seemed frail. He moved with deliberate, unhurried purpose, as though the stick were simply part of how he chose to move through the world. He lived in one of the older houses near the southern building, and occasionally I would see a light in his window very late, when the rest of the settlement was dark. I spoke to him only a handful of times. Each time, I came away from the conversation feeling that more had been communicated than I could identify or account for. He asked questions rather than making statements, and his questions were the kind that assumed a greater familiarity with your own interior life than you were comfortable admitting. Once he asked me, with no particular preamble, "Do you feel that you sleep well here?" I said yes, genuinely. He nodded, as though this confirmed something, and said, "Good, that's an important indicator." Then he walked away before I could ask what it was an indicator of. I mentioned this to Petra. She smiled. The kind of smile people produce when they are being reminded of something they have chosen to stop worrying about. She said, "Theodis keeps track of things. He always has." She paused. "It's better not to ask him direct questions." he answers them honestly. And the answers take a while to understand. I found this an odd thing to say about honesty, as though honesty were something to be approached with caution, but I filed it away. The incident with the east pasture happened in late January, on a day when the snow had hardened into a crust that would hold your weight for 2 steps and then suddenly give, plunging your leg knee-deep into the soft layer beneath. I had been checking the boundary markers in the upper fields. I made a navigational error that I did not recognize as an error until I was already inside it. The eastern pasture boundary extended, according to the old records, to a natural limestone formation marked simply as the shelf. But there was a second, smaller formation beyond it that I had confused with the first. And I had walked past the actual boundary by perhaps 30 meters before I realized. I was not alarmed. I simply turned around and walked back. I had been in the area beyond the boundary for perhaps 5 minutes, doing nothing, just standing, looking at the ridge above me, before I corrected my position. When I returned to the settlement, there was a quality of attention directed toward me that I could feel before I could explain it. Hilda was outside splitting wood. She stopped splitting and watched me cross the yard without appearing to watch me. Maren was sitting on the bench near the communal building, sitting very still in a way that his sitting normally wasn't. Neither of them said anything. Neither of their expressions had changed. It was not that they looked concerned. They looked attentive. They looked as though something they had been monitoring had produced a new data point. Aldrich came to my house that evening. He knocked, came in when I opened the door, sat down in the chair near the stove. He asked me how the boundary work had gone. I told him about the navigational error. Honestly, because there seemed no reason not to. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. He said, "The boundary markers are important to get right, not just for the records." He said it in the same even tone he used for everything. Then he said, "Did you notice anything while you were out there?" I thought about it. I had noticed the ridge, the silence, the way the snow had a different quality on the slope above the formation, grainier and less settled, as though it had been disturbed more recently. I had noticed that there were no bird tracks in the snow beyond the boundary, which I had attributed at the time to the open exposure of the terrain. I told Aldrich this, not because I thought it was significant, but because he had asked, and I was trying to be thorough. His face remained even throughout. When I finished, he said, "The birds don't go past the shelf on the east. It's a local thing." He stood up. He said, "Try to stay within the documented boundaries when you're doing field work. It helps keep the records consistent." He thanked me for the dinner I hadn't offered him, and left. I sat by the stove for a long time after he was gone. The statement about the birds had been offered as explanation, but the more I sat with it, the less it explained. Birds avoid territory for reasons: predators, food scarcity, terrain features. The exposed slope above the eastern pasture was not unusually hostile. There were birds throughout the rest of the upper fields, and Aldrich had known, before I mentioned it, that the birds didn't go there. He had been waiting for me to say it. I did not know why this bothered me as much as it did, only that it did. I began, after that, to keep a private notebook. Not my work notebook, which Aldrich had access to, but a small, personal one that I kept in the inside pocket of my coat. I started writing down observations I had previously only catalogued mentally. The north track, maintained and unused. The east well, functional and avoided. The children and the stream at 3 o'clock. The old building with no windows. The birds beyond the eastern boundary. I began adding dates and times. And as I did, a pattern emerged that had not been visible to me when I was only carrying the information in my head. The things that were avoided, or restricted, or unexplained were not random. They were directional. The north track ran along the ridge. The east well sat at the foot of the eastern slope. The old building was at the south. The stream boundary for the children ran east to west and concentrated specifically on the middle section, which was the deepest and ran fastest, but only on the stretch that passed closest to the old building. I am not a person who tends toward conspiratorial thinking. I mention this because it seems important. I am not someone who finds patterns in randomness and calls them meaning. But these were not patterns in randomness, and these were patterns in behavior. In the behavior of 80 people who had been doing the same things, in the same ways, for what I was beginning to understand was a very long time. I asked Corvan about the old building. I chose Corvan because she was the most direct of the elders, the least prone to deflection. I asked her on a morning when we were both working in the preserved food store. I framed it as a records question. She set down the jar she was holding, slowly, and turned to look at me. Not sharply, not with the involuntary alarm Hilda had shown me, calmly. She looked at me the way a doctor looks at a patient who has just described a symptom the doctor already understands and has been waiting to hear. She said, "The building precedes all of our records. It was here before the community was formally established." She picked up the jar again. "It's maintained because it requires maintenance. The records you're working on don't need to include it because it falls outside the operational scope of the land management system." I said, "What does it require maintenance for?" She said, "Structure and integrity," without any particular emphasis, as though it were the most ordinary answer in the world. Then she said, "You're doing good work, by the way. The updated water rights records are much cleaner than what we had." And that was the end of the conversation. Structure and integrity. A building with iron-bound doors and no ground floor windows required maintenance for structure and integrity. It was a sensible answer. It was a complete non-answer. I had begun to notice that the elders did this. Gave you answers that were technically responsive to the question, but left the actual thing you were asking about entirely unaddressed. It was not evasion, because evasion implies discomfort, and they were never uncomfortable. It was more like someone giving you a map that showed all the roads but had declined to include the destination. Spring came slowly, the way it does in hill country. A gradual relenting rather than an arrival. I had been in Veltaro for nearly 6 months. I was aware that the provisional quality of my first weeks had given way to something more like belonging, or at least its functional equivalent. I knew people's names and their histories and their daily rhythms. I knew whose children were whose and which animals belonged to which family, and where the good mushrooms came in the beechwood. I also knew, by this point, that there were at least 5 other people in the community who had arrived as outsiders and stayed. Petra, obviously, a man named Soren who had been there for 12 years, a quiet woman named Asha, 9 years, 2 brothers, Jakob and Willem, who had come together 8 years ago ostensibly to help with a building project, and simply never left. What I noticed about all of them, and this emerged slowly through small observations over months, was that they shared a quality, not a personality type, not an ideology, more like an orientation, a settled acceptance that there were aspects of Veltarau they did not fully understand and were not going to pursue. Petra, with her careful words, Soren's habit of stopping mid-sentence and then changing direction, as though he had caught himself about to say something he had decided not to say years ago. Jakob and Willem, cheerful and sociable, who became noticeably vaguer whenever I asked about certain things. Not evasive, just vague in the way that suggests the question simply doesn't have traction for them anymore. It was as though the settlement had a gravity that, over time, made certain things feel less worth asking about. I recognize this, and I want to record that I recognized it, because I think it matters. I recognized it, and I also recognized that I was not immune to it. There had been a morning, perhaps a month earlier, when I had been walking near the southern building and had noticed that the iron fitting on the door was newer than the wood around it, recently installed, which meant the door was actively maintained, which meant someone entered regularly. And I had thought about this for perhaps 30 seconds, and then thought about what I was going to make for dinner and continued walking. And it was only later, reviewing my private notebook, that I realized I had noticed something significant and then simply let it go, naturally, without deciding to let it go. The night I actually understood what I was dealing with came in early May. I don't know what woke me. There was no sound, or nothing that I could identify as sound. I was simply awake at an hour when I was normally deep in sleep. And the room felt different in the way that rooms feel different when they have recently had a person in them. The fire had gone low. The window showed a clear, cold sky with stars. I lay still for a while, which is the first instinct. Then I got up, put on my coat, went to the window, and I could see, across the yard, that there was a light in the southern building. Not a window light. There were no windows on the ground floor, but a line of light under the door, pale and steady. And the door was not fully closed. It was ajar by perhaps 2 inches. I stood at my window for a very long time. I did not go outside. I want to be clear about this. I did not go outside. I stood at the window and watched the line of light and the darkness around it, and thought about the east well, and the birds and the children at 3 o'clock, and the north track, and the raked gravel, and Aldrich's question about what I had noticed beyond the boundary, and Corvin saying structure and integrity, and Theodis asking whether I slept well as an important indicator. After approximately 20 minutes, Theodis came out of the southern building. He closed the door behind him with both hands, carefully, leaning into it until the latch caught. He stood for a moment with his back to me, and I could see that he was breathing deliberately, the way you breathe when you are composing yourself. Then he turned and walked toward his house, and as he turned, he passed through the moonlight. Yeah, and I could see his face clearly. He looked tired, not frightened, not distressed, not the expression of a man who has just done something that disturbs him. He looked the way a person looks after a very long shift, when they have done their work competently and it has cost them something, and they are going home. He looked the way someone looks when the work is very old, and they have been doing it for a very long time, and they will do it again. I stepped back from my window. I did not know what was in that building, and I was not going to walk across the yard and look. Not at that hour, not with the quality of certainty in Theodos's bearing that communicated, without words, that things were as they were supposed to be and did not require my involvement. I went back to bed. I did not sleep immediately. In the morning, everything was ordinary. The birds sang, the stream ran. Someone was baking bread in the communal kitchen, and the smell came through my window when I opened it. I went to work on the records. Aldrich came by at mid-morning to review some water rights questions. We talked for an hour, and he was the same as he always was, measured and informed and moderately warm, and nothing in his manner suggested that anything had happened in the night, or that he knew that I had seen what I had seen. I thought about telling him. I thought about it throughout that day and the next. I composed the conversation in my head. I saw Theodos coming out of the southern building at 2 a.m. The door was open. There was light inside, and I could clearly imagine Aldrich's response. The slight pause, on the even tone, the technically responsive but substantively uninformative answer. Theodos checks on the building sometimes. It's part of maintaining it. So I didn't tell him. Instead, I went back through the earliest ledgers. There were entries before the formal ledger system, loose pages in a different hand, bound together and tucked into the back of the first volume. I had scanned them, but not closely read them, because they appeared to be agricultural notes in an old regional shorthand that was difficult to parse. I sat with them for 3 evenings, working slowly through the notation system, and what I found was not agricultural. They were maintenance logs, not of fields or water systems, but of something described only as the condition, recorded weekly, sometimes daily, in terms that were precise but entirely opaque to me without context. The condition stable, north draw holding, east draw requires attention, packed additional material. One entry, from approximately 70 years ago, read, "The new family has been informed at the level appropriate to their tenure. First-year residents are not told the full nature. They are told only what they need to observe. This is the established practice, and it has proved sound." And then, below this, in what appeared to be a different hand, a single addition. The thing below does not change. We change around it. This is sufficient. I read that last sentence several times. I read it until the words temporarily stopped making grammatical sense and became just sounds. Then I read it again, until they made sense again. And the sense they made was not comfortable. I need to try to explain what happened in my thinking over the weeks that followed, because it was not a single revelation. It was a gradual reorganization. The way a picture emerges from a puzzle when you have enough pieces that the remaining gaps become imaginable rather than ambiguous. The rules, I had started thinking of them as rules by this point, were not for the community's safety in any ordinary sense. They were not about keeping people from falling into wells or getting lost on the ridge. They were about maintaining a particular set of conditions that had apparently been in place for a very long time. The boundary at the east pasture was not a property line. The north track was maintained for access, for something's access, not for human convenience. And the human avoidance of it was the point. The children and the stream was about proximity to the south building, about keeping certain categories of person, the young, perhaps, the less controlled, those who might approach without understanding, away from a particular area at particular times. The east well was the one that troubled me most, because water systems that are maintained but not used for drinking are water systems being preserved. For what? I thought about the stream which ran past the south building. I thought about the well's location at the east slope, which was the low point of the drainage from the ridge. I thought about Theotis going into that building in the night with steady steps, and coming out looking like a person who had done a job. I am not a scientist. I am a land records administrator with a background in environmental management. I don't have the vocabulary for what I was beginning to intuit, and I'm honestly not sure the vocabulary exists. What I can say is that the picture the pieces made was of something that had been present in this location for a very long time, longer than the settlement, longer than the earliest records, and that the community of Veltaro had been organized over generations to manage the conditions of its continued presence, not to exploit it, not to destroy it, to manage it, to maintain a situation that had apparently proved through long experience to be livable, to be workable, as long as the conditions were respected. The rules weren't for the community. They were for something else, us, and the community had accepted the role of caretaker, perhaps out of necessity, perhaps out of something else, perhaps. And this was the thought that stayed with me, that had a quality that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite wonder, but was something between them. Perhaps because over enough time, the distinction between caretaker and beneficiary becomes difficult to locate with any precision. I told Petra, eventually. I told her on a warm evening in June when we were sitting outside her workshop and the light was gold and the air smelled like the clay she'd been working all day. I told her what I had seen, what I had found in the old records, what I thought it meant. I didn't frame it as a question. I framed it as a statement, and I watched her face while I talked. She listened without interrupting, which was unlike her normal conversational style. When I was done, she was quiet for a long time, looking at the stream. The light on the water was the particular gold of early evening. The stream ran clear over its stones, and it was beautiful in the uncomplicated way that natural things are beautiful when you haven't yet complicated your relationship to them. She said, "How long did it take you to work that out?" I said, 6 months, more or less. She nodded. She said, "It took me about 3 years. I wasn't paying as close attention as you." Then she said, "Or I was, but I kept talking myself out of it." I asked her what she had done when she understood it. She looked at me then, directly, in a way that was neither reassuring nor alarming, but simply level. She said, I decided that I could live with it, that it was something that had been going on long before me and would go on long after me, and that the conditions it required were not, when examined honestly, unreasonable. Don't use the east well. Don't use the north path at night. Keep the children from the stream in the afternoon. None of it is actually difficult. She paused. I'd been in worse situations, honestly. With less honest management. That phrase, less honest management, I turned it over. She was saying that the elders, who had never fully explained anything, who had given her and me, and presumably all the outsiders, only the minimum they needed in order to behave correctly, were nonetheless the honest ones. They had not told me what was in the southern building. It did, but they had also not made me believe that the building was simply a storage shed. They had not explained the east well. But they had also not claimed it was merely a question of taste. They had let the truth exist at whatever level I was capable of reaching it, and they had not denied it when I reached it. I asked Petra if she had ever spoken to Theodis directly about it. She laughed, quietly. Once, she said. I told him I understood the basic shape of it. He looked at me for a while, and then he said that understanding the basic shape was sufficient for most people, and that further detail tended to be more disorienting than useful. She picked a piece of clay from her thumbnail. He wasn't wrong. Actually, the detail that I have managed to assemble over 7 years has not made me any better at living here. It's just made certain kinds of sleep harder. I asked her what she meant by certain kinds of sleep. She shook her head, not refusing to answer, just indicating that some things didn't translate well into language, that the language she had was insufficient. She said, "You know how sometimes you dream about a place you've never been, and the place has a logic that's entirely coherent inside the dream, but that you can't quite reconstruct when you're awake? It's something like that, except reversed." We sat with that for a while. The stream ran on. Somewhere to the south, I could see the upper corner of the old building against the evening sky, its shuttered windows catching the last of the light. I have now been in Veltaro for 14 months. This feels like a fact worth recording precisely because I notice that it no longer surprises me the way it might have if you had told me on that October evening when I drove the narrow roads with the low amber light that I would still be here more than a year later with no clear plans to leave. I said no clear plans, and I want to examine that phrase because it is not entirely honest. The more honest version would be, I have thought about leaving, and the thought always generates as a counterweight an immediate and rather complete picture of what leaving would look like and what I would be leaving toward. And the picture of what I would be leaving toward is vague and gray and populated with standing over kitchen sinks, while the picture of what I would be leaving is specific and detailed, and, on most days, something I have come to value. I had dinner with Theodis last month. He invited me, which had not happened before. His house was warm. The food was simple. He asked me about my work, about the records, about what I found interesting in the history I had been spending my days inside. He was more talkative than I had seen him in any communal setting. Near the end of the evening, as I was getting ready to leave, he said, "You've been here long enough to understand some things." I said yes. I thought so. He said, The people who stay here successfully are the ones who understand that the arrangement is not a compromise. It is simply a different relationship with the world than the one you were taught to expect." He refilled my glass, though I hadn't asked him to. In most places, people live on top of things they don't know about and couldn't manage if they did. Here, we know. We manage. That is a different position than ignorance, even if it feels from the outside like the same thing. I thought about the old records. The thing below does not change. We change around it. This is sufficient. I thought about the birds avoiding the eastern slope, and the light under the door in the night, and Corvin's steady hand setting down a jar of preserved vegetables. And Aldrich's voice moving through every kind of information in the same unchanged register. I thought about 80 people who lived ordinary days on top of an understanding that most of the world didn't have and wouldn't know how to carry. I asked Theodis how old the arrangement was. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Older than this building, older than the community, older than the oldest entries in your records." I asked him if the thing that was being managed had ever been dangerous. He was quiet for long enough that I understood the quiet as a complete answer in itself. Then he said, "It is what it is. We are what we have become in relation to it. Dangerous is a word from outside the situation, and outside the situation is where it doesn't fully apply." I walked home that night through the settlement, past the communal building with its banked fire, past Petra's workshop, past the east well that stood in the moonlight, perfectly still, past the path that led south and the old building at its end, its door closed, its upper shutters latched. The stars were out. The stream sounded exactly as a stream sounds in the night. Somewhere on the northern ridge, something made a sound that I could not identify. And the sound stopped, and the silence that came after was the kind of silence that has something in it, that is not empty. Though I could not tell you what it contained, I went inside. I lit the stove. I sat at my desk and opened my private notebook and looked at the list of things I had written down in the months since I arrived. And the list was not disturbing to me in the way it had been. It was informative. It was a map, partial and imprecise, of a territory that I had been permitted to enter and that I was, through no design of my own, continuing to learn. I thought about the word Theodis had used, arrangement. It is a word that assumes multiple parties. It is a word that assumes that someone on both sides of the agreement had, at some point, consented to terms, and that the terms had been found workable, and that the arrangement had been maintained long enough that the original moment of agreement had receded entirely into history, leaving only the practice, the maintenance, the careful ordinary days of people who knew something and kept it in order and lived their lives in the space that the knowing allowed. I don't know if I have consented to anything. I don't know if consent is how it works here, or whether what I have done in staying is simply become legible to the arrangement in the way that water becomes legible to the shape of the land it moves through. I don't know what is in the southern building, and I have stopped expecting to know. I don't know exactly what Theodis does in there at 2 a.m, and I suspect that if I ever do know, it will be because I have been here long enough that the knowing has become part of what I am for, rather than something I sought out. The elders are not afraid of what they know. That is the thing I have come to understand most clearly. In every story I had absorbed, growing up, about people who discover that the world contains hidden things, the people are afraid. They try to expose the secret, or destroy it, or flee from it. But the elders of Veltharo are not afraid, and they have not been afraid for a very long time. And when I try to imagine what produced that steadiness, not the fearlessness of ignorance, but the fearlessness of thorough familiarity, I find myself thinking that it must have taken generations, multiple lifetimes of people making the same decision that Petra made, that I suspect Soren made, that I am in the process, slowly, of making myself. The decision is not brave. It is not a grand acceptance. It is smaller than that and more durable. It is waking up and making coffee and going to work on the records and walking the boundaries and eating dinner and watching the light change on the hill and sleeping deeply in the clean cold air of a stone house in a valley where things are known and managed and where the knowing does not make the coffee taste worse or the light less good or the sleep less deep. I will stay another year. I decided this recently in the way that I have noticed decisions get made here, which is not as a moment but as an accumulation, a gradual shift from I haven't left yet to I am staying, with no clear line between them. I will stay another year, I will continue the records. I will learn more of the shorthand in the early documents. I will walk the boundaries carefully, use the right well, watch the afternoon with the children and the stream, and I will be here when the next outsider arrives. Because I understand now that outsiders arrive periodically, that this is part of how the community renews itself, and that there is a reason Aldrich's response to my application came within 48 hours, and that the reason is not simply that no one else applied. The elders know more than they reveal. I know this as certainly as I have ever known anything. I know that what they reveal is exactly as much as each person needs at each moment, calibrated over long experience to produce the outcome that the arrangement requires. I know that the full truth, whatever it is, whatever it looks like in its complete form, lives in the old building and in the east slope and in the movement of water through the land and in Theodos's tired and steady face in the moonlight, and that I am approaching it incrementally. The way the settlement has always brought people toward it, not by telling them, but by giving them a life in which the truth is simply the ground under everything, present whether or not it is seen, real whether or not it is named. The stream runs. The fruit trees have come into blossom, white against the green of the hill. The air tonight is cold and clean. In the morning, I will have coffee and go to work. And somewhere beneath all of it, something continues, as it has always continued, as it will continue after me, patient, old, and entirely accustomed to being managed by people who understand just enough to do their part. I find lately that I sleep without dreaming. Petra said that would happen eventually. She said it in the same tone she uses for practical information, for things that are simply true, for the kind of knowledge you acquire by staying somewhere long enough that the place begins to keep its records inside you, and you become, without noticing the moment it happened, part of how it remembers itself,